Well, it's good to be down the mountain talking to y'all here in Winston-Salem. We were talking, just mentioned briefly earlier a few minutes ago, I was last in Winston-Salem talking 6 or 7 years ago, and there were a couple of y'all folks that were there when I visited this area. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Gettysburg. As your commander said, I have written a lot of books, a lot of magazine articles. I have been obsessed with mid-19th century America since I went to that first reenactment in November of 1982. And I've researched and written about a lot of things, but it's always one of the things that I'm really passionate about is the common soldier. And it's probably because I grew up reenacting and going to all of these events that made such a impressionation on me. The common soldier, the life, his life, the things that he went through, the things that people back home went through. As I'm working on my first book, which was on the 37th Regiment, I start coming across all of these Gettysburg letters. Not only from that regiment, but from other regiments as well. And I start collecting them, saying that one day I'm going to do something with all of these letters. And I had finished a book on another North Carolina regiment, the 58th Regiment, and I decided that it was time to put this together. And I collected some more letters, and I put together a book that's got 77 first-person letters about the Battle of Gettysburg, all from Tar Heel soldiers. And I put a little talk together. And in this talk, I'm actually going to read to you here in just a few minutes some of their letters so you know exactly what was going on. Some of these letters are actually written during the battle itself. Some of them written later on. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Gettysburg is the most famous battlefield in the United States. I don't know how many of y'all have ever been to the park, but you go up there, there is always a crowd. I have been up there different times of the year. School kids, folks wandering around the battlefield with their maps and with their books. That's me. I'm always out there trying to figure out where somebody was at. People taking pictures. It's just the most visited battlefield in the United States. And it's had that attraction ever since the battle was going on. The Battlefield Association was formed but a few weeks after the battle it had taken place there in July of 1863. If you go and read North Carolina history, or at least up until just recently, there's always some mention of North Carolina soldiers and what took place there in the battle. In 1908, historian Samuel Acorn Ash wrote that, quote, instances of individual heroism on the part of the North Carolina soldier in this battle make a roll of honor itself a crown of glory to the state. And he later added that North Carolinians advanced further on that field than any other troops, and that Picketts Charge has brought to the state imperishable glory and renown. 1929, another writer by the name of Robert Connor added that, quote, at Gettysburg, North Carolina soldiers reached the pinnacle of military greatness. And even a book written in 1916 called The Young People's History of North Carolina considered Gettysburg the great battle. There are several reasons, compelling reasons, why we and you as North Carolinians put such great emphasis on that battle. A good portion of the Army of Northern Virginia, under the command of Robert E. Lee, was made up of Tar Heel soldiers. Of the estimated 15,000 Confederate killed and wounded at Gettysburg, 4,033 of them were from here. They were Tar Heel soldiers. That's a little over 25%, or, as according to one of the markers, the monuments in Gettysburg says, 1 out of every 4 battlefield losses on the Confederate side came from this state. Many Tar Heels felt compelled to record their experiences about the battle and send those letters back home to their loved ones. Some of them were actually amateur journalists. They were not necessarily paid by a newspaper, but they sent these letters back, and newspaper editors printed these letters so people could learn what was going on. A few of these letters contained the list that no family really wanted to see. They were the list of the men who had been killed and wounded during the battle. For a brief amount of time, And those were the letters written during the battle itself. For a brief amount of time, about 15 years after the war ended, there's not really anybody talking about Gettysburg in North Carolina. The war was too fresh, casualties too real, and everybody was busy. They had farms to build, lives to rebuild. They had to get on with their lives. That changed in 1877 when one of Robert E. Lee's former staff officers, Colonel Robert Taylor, published a book called 4 Years with General Lee. In that book, Taylor claimed that the divisions of Pettigrew and Trimble, which contained many North Carolinians, had been placed in support of Pickett's division during the charge on the third day, on July 3rd of 1863. Taylor wrote that, quote, the assaulting columns really consisted of Pickett's division, and that Pickett's men were the only organized body that entered the works of the enemy. If that was not enough, Taylor would go on to say that the natural open terrain and the Federal infantry and artillery entrenched in front of them, quote, produced their natural effects upon Pettigrew's division, and the brigades supporting it causing them to falter. He basically said that your Tar Heel ancestors abandoned the Virginians on July 3rd of 1863. These were not new charges leveled at North Carolina soldiers. The newspapers in Richmond, right after the battle had been fought, had said as much. And while there was an outcry of North Carolinians, so many of the people who could answer those charges in 1863 were dead, or were in prison, or were in hospitals, and could not write to the newspapers expressing what they had gone through and what they had achieved. Things were different. In 1877, the Raleigh Observer stepped up to the challenge and sent out a list of questions to every North Carolina officer who was involved in the battle and could be located. Their rebuttals to Colonel Taylor's accusations were printed all at one time and occupied several pages in the October 30th, 1877 edition of the newspaper. In chronicling these experiences, many of the writers were cautious, realizing that even a short amount of time, 15 years, that had elapsed since the battle had taken place, could or had altered their memories, already clouded by the fog or the smoke and confusion of battle. Y'all probably heard the opinion where if you have an auto accident and you place a man in that corner and a man in that corner and two other people in those corners, everybody gives a different view or interpretation of that auto accident that they had just witnessed. We'll put 15,000 people in a charge with smoke, somebody shooting at you, confusion, people yelling, people getting shot. Do you think you get a lot of different interpretations about what's going on? Very much so. We'll get a little more about that here in just a minute. Thomas P. Mallory, who was adjutant of the 7th North Carolina State Troops, said it best when he wrote to the Raleigh Observer. He wrote, quote, of course, after such a lapse of time, one cannot have a very distinct recollection of events. That sentiment was expressed over and over again through the decades by the people who were actually at the battle, who had actually fought there on those days in July of 1863. While the veterans wrote for many different reasons, one really stands out above all of the others. They wrote so that what they had done those 3 days in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania should not be forgotten. Quote, anything I say for the vindication of our noble troops on that Memorial Day, you shall cheerfully have. Chronicled Adjutant D.M. McIntyre in 1877. John Hood of Caldwell County echoed his comrade's thoughts in closing, quote, his already too lengthy article, hoping it may be a help in answering and awarding what Company F of the 26th North Carolina troops, what they justly merit as veterans of the lost cause. Historian Thomas Desjardins once wrote that history is not necessarily a record of the facts, but rather a reckoning of the stories of past events arranged so they make sense to those do the reckoning. Taken as a whole, the book, the letters that I collected on the Battle of Gettysburg, is not necessarily a record of the facts. They're just what the veterans themselves remembered. A soldier in the 4th North Carolina State Troops, writing at the end of July 1863, stated that the cannonading lasted 3 hours. This is an example of that. While a soldier in the 11th North Carolina State Troops, writing 31 years after the battle, believed that the bombardment lasted just half an hour. Today, we say that that bombardment before the charge on July 3rd of 1863 lasted 1 hour. Everybody who was there had a different interpretation. For whatever the old soldiers might have got wrong, what they did chronicle in both public and private documents are the building blocks of historians' interpretations of the great Battle of Gettysburg. If we didn't have what they wrote, we don't know what they did. I'll give you a good example. Working on a book right now about the Branch Lane Brigade, all Tar Heel Brigade that fought in the Army of Northern Virginia. The Battle of 2nd Manassas, the 33rd Regiment gets ordered off on the far Confederate left, and I lose them. Nobody that I have found wrote what they did once they got ordered off to the far left. They're just lost for me right now. And until I find somebody who says, we went over there and we spread out, and we served, we guarded the left flank, we deployed as a skirmish line, I really don't know. I think that's what they did, but I can't come out and say that because I don't have anybody telling me what they did. Take this letter, for example, about Gettysburg. This letter was written July 3rd of 1863. The battle is still going on as this soldier sits down that morning to pen an account. This is what he wrote. Quote, I feel it my duty to communicate the painful and melancholy intelligence to you of the death of Colonel Henry K. Burgoyne, who was killed nobly fighting for his country July 1st, 1863. He was shot through both lungs and died an easy death. I have buried him as well as possible under a walnut tree leading from Gettysburg to Chambersburg, about 2 miles from the former place. His loss is great, more than any of us can imagine, to his country. To me it is also stunning, and to the whole regiment. We gained a great victory on the 1st of the month, the enemy losing 12,000, it is said. But though ours was not though ours was not a fourth so large, talking about casualties, his death made it great. Poor Kincaid, his servant, takes it bitterly. The Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel James R. Lane, and Captain W.W. McCree, and 8 others were shot down in succession with our colors in hand. Captain McGreeley killed instantly. Lieutenant Colonel Lane seriously wounded, if not mortally. The regiment went in 800 strong and came out the first day with but 250 men. The fighting yesterday and today has been terrible, and will continue tomorrow, I suppose. General James J. Pettigrew is in command of our division. Major John T. Jones of the 26th is in command of the brigade. This will give you an idea of the frightful loss among the officers. If y'all have studied the 26th Regiment, you know what happened to Colonel Burgoyne. He had picked up that flag after so many color bearers had been shot down, and he had turned and started to lead his men up a charge up that hill to drive those Federal soldiers away. And he was shot. And as he fell to the ground, that flag encased his body. So the next time you go to the Museum of History in Raleigh and find the flag of the 26th, it's got his blood on it, along with those of many other men. But there are many stories just like that about Gettysburg. On the morning of the first day of July, the brigade of General Alfred Iveson commenced its march, and near Gettysburg was formed into a line of battle. With Colonel O'Neill's Alabama Brigade on its left, it advanced in the direction of Gettysburg, covered by the 1st Corps sharpshooters, until these skirmishers became engaged with the enemy's cavalry in a low flat land about 1,000 yards from town. The brigade was then moved by the right flank to the hills in that direction, where the enemy was supposed to be advancing his infantry against the battalion of artillery. The enemy did not advance as he was expected to. And the enemy never really does what you expect them to do. Is that correct? The enemy did not advance as he was expected to do, but in a few minutes, an order was received to follow up any movement of the brigade on our left. Just then the brigade of Colonel O'Neill commenced to march forward. The brigade of General Iverson on the right followed up the movement and advanced in order already mentioned against the enemy. For some reason, O'Neill's brigade halted, but the brigade of General Iverson had advanced with such rapidity as to have no knowledge whatever of O'Neill's movements after he had commenced the advance, and consequently attacked the enemy single-handed in its front. The men of the 5th North Carolina bore themselves in all this desperate encounter with a determined valor and devoted zeal. Their ranks were decimated by the terrific fire to which they were subjected, and they suffered such a loss as no other troops had ever sustained in this or any other war. But the force of the enemy was so far superior in numbers and had such an excellent advantage of position, it was impossible to dislodge him. Yet even in the face of such odds as these, the men did not falter but held their ground until reinforced by the brigades of O'Neill and Stephen D. Ramseur. Nor did they neglect to join in the pursuit through the town when these brigades put the enemy to flight. In the hottest of the fire, the enemy closed in upon our lines, pouring a murderous fire into our men, and in many cases bayoneted them. When some of the wounded cried out for quarter and raised their handkerchiefs as an appeal for mercy. This, Governor, has given rise to a report that the regiment surrendered. That charge I denounce as an infamous falsehood and malicious slander. No surrender was authorized. No order was given for cessation of the fire. Our colors were brought in triumph from the field, pierced with 15 balls, and the staff shattered into pieces. We lost only 3 officers prisoner. And of the 55 men who are missing, I am firmly of the opinion that not more than 40 of those that fell in the enemy's hands are unhurt. The pale, bloody corpses of its noble men who lie sleeping on the hillside near Gettysburg, the shrieks of its wounded on that field, the mangled bodies of its officers and soldiers, attest in tones of mighty significance and touching eloquence to the gallantry of our regiment on that occasion, and stamps as a falsehood the ungenerous aspirations that have been leveled at its fair fame. The 5th, according to newspaper accounts, had surrendered. And the commanding officer had written this letter, which was publicly, and a lot of times the men did write these letters, and they did ask different newspapers to publish them. They were trying to clear their record. They were trying to clear their good name about what they had experienced that afternoon on July 5th, or on July 1st of 1863. Here's another letter written by another soldier. This actually takes place. If you ever studied the Battle of Gettysburg, you know that North Carolinians were involved most of day 1, and then on day 2, except for the Rowan artillery in Longstreet's Corps, which is on the far right, and the Hoke's Brigade under Colonel Tate on the far left, North Carolinians for the most part sit out day 2 of the battle. Heavily involved in day 1, but it's they are not that involved in a lot of the actions. You know, we talk about how many of y'all seen the movie Gettysburg? We talk about that. If you've seen that, you know, they talk about the Alabamians' attack against Chamberlain in the 20th Maine on the far Confederate right in the battle. North Carolinians sit out the battle for most of the day until we get to the end of day 2 of July 2nd, 1863. And this letter comes from one of the soldiers who was involved in that attack on the far left of the Confederate line. This is what he wrote. About 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, we were ordered to advance and charge the breastworks on the hill in front of us, where the enemy was entrenched. There was an awful roar of big guns and musketry, and we charged up that steep hill between a quarter and a half mile. The enemy's batteries kept up a terrific fire, but most of the shells and the grape passed over our heads. Colonel Avery fell about halfway between the ravine where we had camped and the stone fence on the hill used as a breastwork by the enemy. Do y'all remember that story of Colonel Avery? He's the one who scribbled the note. You can go to the museum, they have it on display a lot of time. He was colonel of the 6th North Carolina State Troops, and he's the one who scribbled that note as he lay there on the battlefield that evening that says, "Major, tell my father I died with my face toward the enemy." It's one of those things every North Carolinian, young and old, should know and should go see, because the letter is stained with his blood. He passed not long after that. Colonel Samuel McDowell Tate, the next in rank, took command of the brigade. Our brigade charged in good order until we were within a short distance of the stone fence, which did not extend all the way across the face of the hill. Here the brigade spread out across the face of the hill, part of the men making for the ends of the fence, as I recollect. About 75 of our brigade, led by Colonel Tate and Captain Neil Ray, charged directly on the stone fence, which we crossed and then bayoneted the Yankee gunners and drove them back after a hard fight. About 20 men attached to a Louisiana brigade crossed the fence about the same time we did. We turned some of the guns on the enemy and tried to fire them, but most had already been spiked by the Yankees. By this time, it was getting dark, and the enemy we had driven back had been heavily reinforced, and after remaining beyond the fence some 15 or 20 minutes, we withdrew and rejoined our brigade. And that night, we started on our return march to Virginia. He was wrong about that part. They didn't start on their return march for another day, but hey, he's writing about 30 years after the battle had taken place. Had those North Carolinians been reinforced that evening, that could have turned the tide of the Battle of Gettysburg. They sent numerous requests back saying, bring up more men, bring up more men. We've got the top of this hill. We can plant artillery in it and enfilade the entire Federal line, and they will be forced to withdraw. And those reinforcements never came. July 3rd, 1863. And North Carolinians are once again in the forefront of the battle. On the afternoon. Y'all probably call it Picketts Charge. Our Virginia, anybody in here from Virginia? I'm sorry. Don't take an offense. My mom's from Virginia. My wife was born in Portsmouth. So, the Virginians only call it Picketts Charge because they only recognize their own soldiers being involved in the battle. Well, there were more North Carolinians there than Virginians during that charge. So we call it Longstreet's Assault, or we call it the Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble Charge. We seldom call it Pickett's Charge, because that just goes to show that mindset, that there were only those soldiers involved. There were actually a lot of North Carolinians there in Pettigrew's division, which was to the left of Pickett's division, and there were two North Carolina brigades behind Pettigrew's division. They were the brigades of Lane and Scales, and they were under the command of General Trimble. He was actually appointed to that position right before the charge took place. And Brigadier General Lane returned to his brigade while Trimble took command. This is from Lane's official report. This is what he wrote. Now in command of my own brigade, I moved forward to the support of Pettigrew's right through the woods in which our batteries were planted, and through an open field about a full mile in view of the enemy's fortified position, and under a murderous artillery and infantry fire. As soon as Pettigrew's command gave back, Lawrence's brigade and my own, without having ever halted, took position on the left of the troops still contesting the ground with the enemy. My command never moved more handsomely. The men reserved their fire in compliance with orders until within good range of the enemy, and then opened with telling effect, repeatedly driving the cannoneers from their pieces, completely silencing the guns in our immediate front, and breaking the line of infantry which was formed on the crest of the hill. We advanced to within a few yards of the stone wall, exposed all the while to a heavy ranking artillery fire from the right. My left here was very much exposed, and a column of infantry was thrown forward in that direction, which enfiladed my entire line. This forced me to withdraw my brigade. The troops on my right, meaning Pickett, having already done so, we fell back as well as could be expected, reformed immediately in rear of the artillery, as directed by General Trimble, and remained there until the following morning. I cannot speak too highly of my brigade in this bloody engagement. Both officers and men moved forward with a heroism unsurpassed, giving the brigade inspector and his rear guard nothing to do. Our great loss tells but too sadly of the gallant bearing of my command. 660 out of an effective total of 1,355, including ambulance corps and the rear guard, our loss on the 1st and 2nd being but slight. They continued to write these letters. 1890s, 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930. Now when you start getting to the 1920s and the 1930s, you have to be careful. The war has been 50 or 60 or 70 years older, but they still wanted to tell you their story, to pass along what they had experienced, not only in Gettysburg, but so many of these battles and so many of these conflicts that took place in that time period. They wanted you to remember what they had done. That's what's so important about the Sons of Confederate Veterans. We are the folks, the men, the women, the young folks, the old folks. We're the people that remember and should be remembering those stories. Because if you don't remember, if you don't go to the memorial services, if you don't protect the monuments, if you don't go to the local libraries and talk about what those soldiers did, if you don't talk about among yourselves, if you don't share with your kids and your grandkids, nobody will remember. And that's the worst kind of death, is that forgetfulness. Nobody will know. We hit the 200th anniversary. I'm not so sure I'll make it. Keith, I'm not so sure I'll make the 200th anniversary, the bicentennial of the war between the states. I might, but probably not. Definitely won't be up talking about it anymore. Is anybody going to remember the bicentennial of the war? If we don't get out and we don't talk about it, if we don't recruit our camps, if we don't collect these letters, who's going to? It's our job to make sure that that is passed on to future generations. That's what our charge says. It's to pass on the information about what North Carolina did at Gettysburg and all of these other battles. And not just North Carolina. I got Virginia ancestors too, and what they did was important during the war as well. But it's our job. So do you have any questions about Gettysburg, 37th, 58th, Charlotte, or in general?
You said the cannon fire.
Yes.
Now there were like 200 and some cannons lined up of the Union, correct? And you said it only went for about an hour?
Yes.
Is that right?
As the story goes, the Federal Artillery Commander, I think his last name was Hunt. Henry Hunt. The last name was Hunt. Purposely ordered his cannoneers to stop firing. And at times he actually pulled batteries offline and had fresh batteries to go into their place. But it was, military thing at that time period, you have a big bombardment, you know what's coming next. There's going to be an infantry charge. So to coax those men out of that woods and into that open field, he ordered his cannoneers to stop firing.
Because up there at the battlefield, I've been there twice.
Mm-hmm.
They tell that a different story about. It's a lot longer than that. I forgot what.
That's the common thought, is that bombardment on July 3rd lasted an hour. Went from 2 to 3 o'clock, and the charge started around 3 o'clock.
And that was what, 200, 250?
Something, a little over 200. A lot of cannons. Yes, sir.
On the first day, 26 North Carolina, you said that how many people went into the battle?
Around 800.
Around 800. And how many people picked up the flag before we were shot down?
There were, I have to go back and read my own book. Over the course of the entire battle, there were like 12 or 13 men who picked up that flag and were shot or were killed. There were 8 before Burgoyne picked it up and was killed.
And you say only 250?
More or less.
More or less.
On day one.
On day one.
Yes.
And that, from the time they marched in to the time they came back, was over a period of how long?
On day one, they were involved about 45 minutes.
So they lost over
60.
80% of their unit in less than an hour of battle.
Yes.
So they just try to put that thought into people's minds.
11th North Carolina, which was on their right, charging the same position, lost almost as many men. Not quite as many flag bearers, but they're not far behind the 26 numbers. Now bear in mind that these regiments of Pettigrew's brigade were not green, but the 26th had fought at Malvern Hill and had fought at the Battle of Newbern, and the 11th had seen action as well. But they had been on coastal duty, or in that area, southeast Virginia, northeastern North Carolina, for months and months, and were very large regiments. The 26th, there were some brigades in Lee's army that didn't number 800 men as they're going into the fight, because they had seen action from the 7 days through the first Maryland campaign, Cedar Mountain, 2nd Manassas, Ox Hill or Chantilly, Harper's Ferry, Sharpsburg. They had been at Fredericksburg. They had been at Chancellorsville. The losses on Lee's army at Chancellorsville are unreal. And there are some, I actually went back and did a book about Chancellorsville, North Carolina, Chancellorsville as well. And there are a lot of Tar Heel soldiers who thought Chancellorsville a worse battle than Gettysburg was. Just because you were fighting more or less in the wilderness. And the woods caught fire at Chancellorsville just like they did at Spotsylvania in the wilderness. Any other thoughts?
At Round Top.
Little Round Top.
At Gettysburg.
Yes.
How many Confederate soldiers were killed in that?
Oh, I don't remember that.
Wasn't it 1,600?
Maybe. It was an Alabama brigade, and then it probably wasn't 1,600 killed. There may be 1,600 men in that brigade.
Oh, it was Alabama?
All Alabama.
Oh, okay.
Yep. That made that charge up Little Round Top, fighting against Chamberlain and the rest of his brigade, Strong Vincent's brigade. But I don't remember how many were in that Alabama brigade. I should know that. Sorry. I can look it up.
We're all getting older.
Yeah, we are getting older.
Do you have a website?
I do have a website. You can find me online at michaelchoardy.com. I got a blog that I used to do a lot with, and I'm planning to get back to it. And you can find me on Facebook.
Oh, really?
Some folks think I'm always on Facebook, right? Facebook is just an easy way for me to put up where I'm going to be, or to ask questions. I asked a lot of questions on my Facebook about things that I'm researching, and a lot of folks put in there, well, what's the answer? Well, I don't have the answer. That's why I'm asking you. Maybe you have encountered this in your research, and can help me out. As I said before, I'm working on a book right now about Branch Lane Brigade, which is composed of the 7th, 18th, 28th, 33rd, and 37th North Carolina regiments. They were the hardest fighting regiment in the Army of Northern Virginia. 3 of those regiments suffered more losses than any other North Carolina regiment during the war. So, I think the title of the book, well, I can't tell you that yet. I'll tell you that in a minute. Yes, sir.
When you're talking about these units, you're
Yes.
talking about units of infantry, not
Yes.
cavalry.
The cavalry, North Carolina cavalry action, the cavalry at Gettysburg really didn't do anything until the afternoon of July 3rd. You probably remember the story that Lee had given orders to General Stuart, and Stuart had rode off into the great beyond, and nobody quite knew where he was. And he had actually went up and had circled around the Federal Army and had captured a Federal baggage wagon, and partially deprived Lee of his eyes and ears, because the cavalry were the scouts or the information officers for the Confederate Army, for both armies really. Now I say partially. Lee still had 2 brigades of cavalry with him, but he did not use them very effectively. He didn't know their commanders, and he had posted one at the rear of his column, and the other one was just spread out, and Lee didn't use the cavalry that he had available. So there is a little information about the 1st North Carolina Cavalry at Gettysburg, but there were not a lot of North Carolina cavalry present at the battle.
What about the North? Were they using cavalry?
Well, yes. If you go back to the very start of the Battle of Gettysburg, there is a Federal Cavalry division that actually comes into Gettysburg and goes to the west of town, and it's that cavalry that holds off Confederate infantry long enough for the Federal infantry to come up. Federal Cavalry under the command of Buford. I don't remember his first name right now. John Buford had actually held long enough for Federal infantry to advance. And so Meade is using, the Federal General, George Meade, is using his cavalry much more effectively at that battle than Lee did. Any other questions? Thoughts or comments? Ideas? Michael, you're crazy.
I've got one more.
Okay.
One more question. Do you happen to know how many flags North Carolina lost on that day?
No, and we won't ever quite know that number. Strangely enough, in all of my research about different regiments and Confederate flags and things, usually if you lost a flag during battle, you didn't write home saying, well, we lost another flag. Send us another one because that one's gone. I mean, losing your flag was a blight upon your regiment. There was some Federal regiment I was reading an article about the other day. It may have been the 79th New York Highlanders, and they were such a bad bunch that they actually, the Federal Army commander actually took their flag away until their discipline improved and he gave them their flag back. I mean, the flag for either side during the war is more than just a point to rally on during the battle. It is a badge of honor, and to lose that flag, you don't write home about that, usually. That being said, there are numerous flags that appeared in the War Department's collections later on, or wound up in private collections that are attributed to various North Carolina regiments that were lost at Gettysburg. But we don't actually know how many of them there were. The 37th North Carolina, which I have written a book about, might have lost a flag at Gettysburg, but I can't actually say that with any shred of evidence.
There's a story that I know of. I can't remember which unit it was, but there was a story of a flag bearer who was being, his unit was pretty much getting decimated, and the enemy and then had come face to face. He had his hands on his unit's flag, and the enemy had gotten their hands on it. Mm-hmm. And a fight ensued between the flag, and an actual Union officer took his saber and cut the flag in half. Mm-hmm. And after the war, the Confederate soldier still had his half. Mm-hmm. The Union soldier still had his half, and I believe it was at the 1920 Gettysburg reunion that these two actually came together and found each other and put the two pieces back together. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know if you happen to remember which North Carolina unit that was.
Not offhand, but I can see that flag in my brain up there.
I just know that's a great story.
If you'll shoot me a note, I will look it up, because I know that story and I can see the flag. It wasn't actually cut in half, it was cut in half this way. Or it was ripped. I can't say that it was cut, but it was ripped in half.
I mean, it was definitely torn by the saber, from what I was told. I think it's in, they talk about in the book, the damned red flags of the Confederacy.
Of the Rebellion. Damned
Red
Red Flags of the Rebellion, which is a great book. It really is. But no, I don't remember offhand. We won't ever know how many flags the Confederacy lost at Gettysburg, or the Union, for that matter, lost at Gettysburg. But we could go through. North Carolina has the third largest Confederate battle flag collection in the world. And it's, I don't know, did anybody here go to the flag program we did? When was that, Keith? January?
Yeah.
A year ago?
Yeah,
Maybe January a year ago at the North Carolina Museum of History in Raleigh?
because it was, wasn't it the same as, time as, Robert E. Lee Day?
No, I don't think so.
Wasn't?
I don't remember. Anyway,
Was that when they did 4 flags at once?
yes.
Oh, it was a parade we were in.
Yeah.
Anyway, sometime in the last year, the North Carolina Division has actually raised money to have these flags conserved. There are over 100 Confederate battle flags at the North Carolina Museum of History, and the state has no money to have these flags preserved. So various groups, both the North Carolina Division, I know other individual SCV camps, I know reenacting groups like the 26th North Carolina Reactivated have raised money to have these flags conserved, and they are often put on display. And on 3 different occasions I have been able to stand on that stage and talk about that flag. And I did the 4 at once last year for the North Carolina Division. But it's just, that's one of the highlights of my career. I've got to uncover 2 of them and present them to the general public, but that's just phenomenal to be able to do that. So if your camp is ever looking for a project, check out the archives or the museum, contact them folks and see what you can do. It normally costs $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 to do one of the cotton flags. And if you're really ambitious, take on one of the silk flags, because they are $20,000 projects. I kid you not.
They're worth it.
They're worth every penny of it. To be able to walk into the Museum of History and I'd say they normally have, between the gallery downstairs and the gallery upstairs, they normally have probably 20 flags, 25 flags on display at any given time. Confederate battle flags on display. Yes, sir.
Who got the restored flag? Where is it? It was cut in half and then 20 years later put back together.
They didn't keep, I don't think they kept it back together. The Confederate took his part home and the Yank took his part home. They just put it back together for the reunion.
I think there is an actual, I think a museum has it, because if I'm not mistaken, there's a laser scan of that actual flag in that book I was talking about.
So I've got that book, but I can only,
Open it up, I'm pretty sure.
I only remember the bottom, or that part of the flag, but I may be thinking of another book.
Possibly might, I might be mistaken too, but I could have sworn another flag we're talking about, I could have sworn I've seen both halves of it in one.
It's possible. We'll have to go home and look that up.
That's another project.
Considering that there are over 600 Confederate regiments throughout the South, surprisingly, the information about flags for individual regiments is rather sparse. I know, going back to use the 37th as another example, I know the flag they got in November, December of 1862, and they had to have more flags, but I could never find them. Could never find any reference to them, period. I mean, just the information. And I'm the type of person that I dig and 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 dig. And even after that manuscript had gone in, I contacted the publisher and said, hey, I need to change something. And, rewrote parts of it because I had found some little new piece of information. But there is a book on North Carolina flags out there by, can't remember his last name, starts with a D. But it's not complete. I mean, there's so many other flags out there. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You did that on November 9th.
I did that on November 9th? Cool. 2013.
Wasn't
Good.
as long ago as you thought.
Nope. It's one of the disadvantages to being on the road all the time. Any other questions? Well, thank y'all very much.
Oh, thank you.